Good evening. My name is Buzz Scherr. This is the third in the virtual faculty lecture series. I'm going to talk about Russian election meddling and thinking about the alleged Russian meddling as both cybercrime and perhaps a cause for cyber war. So I want to, at the front end, describe what we're talking about. We're talking about two different kinds of Russian meddling, both apparently state-sponsored. The first kind is the theft of the emails from the Democratic National Committee, and for that matter from the Republican National Committee, that were then sent to WikiLeaks and were published. Accompanying that, the same operation apparently during the election hacked into state and local election boards, and really the only evidence out there about that is they took a look at the apparatus of the state and local election boards, but there's no evidence that there was any vote tampering or any votes changed as a part of that effort. So that's category one, the email hacking and the hacking into election board systems. Category two is the more recent development of the 13 federal indictments of a corporation and several, about a dozen people from St. Petersburg, Russia, who were involved in a very sophisticated campaign. Some of it involved in hacking, some of it involved in actual physical presence in the United States, and some of it involved in fake rallies and things like that. So I'm going to primarily focus on the first category, but much of what I'm going to say applies to the second category also. So there have been no, excuse me, no indictments of anybody regarding the emails and the election board hacking. It certainly is under investigation, but whether indictments are returned or not remains to be seen. There have been the 13 indictments that I've briefly described in the second category. One of the premises of this conversation with you is very simple. You can indict somebody who is in another country, who has hacked into a server of some sort or some other computer network in the United States. You can indict them for a number of different kinds of cyber crimes. Hacking itself can be, although not in those words, but can in itself be a cyber crime, interfering or entering unauthorized entry into a cyber network. You can return a federal indictment against somebody who committed a crime and they never set foot in the United States in the commission of the crime. Particularly in the area of cybercrime, that's very possible, using a legal principle called extraterritorial jurisdiction. And so you can indict that person, and you can, most often in federal court, and you can seek to prosecute them in federal court using the federal adjudicatory system. The fundamental problem and the interesting thing about the Russian meddling is effectively, even if you indict them, the prosecution's going to go nowhere, because you need to get that person to the United States before you can put them on trial. You need to collect evidence, not just for an indictment, but you need to collect evidence for prosecution and meeting the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt as to the elements of the particular cyber offense. So the irony is you can indict someone like they did in the 13 federal indictments, but those indictments, but for some high-end stupidity on the part of those who are indicted, those indictments are going nowhere. They are effectively unprosecutable because the individuals that they indicted in the 13 federal indictments, they all live in Russia, in the St. Petersburg, Russia area. The only way you can there's only a few ways you can get those individuals to the United States for trial. One, you can ask Russia to send them to you. The Russian Federation could you send us those people who you asked to engage in this meddling? so we can prosecute them and put them in jail in the United States. You can do that, and I think we all know what the answer is going to be. That's not going to happen. Or you can try and use the formal adjudicatory process known as extradition. If you have an extradition treaty with a country, which we have with many countries, what the extradition treaty does is create a process for the U.S. government filing paperwork with that country and the appropriate authorities in the country from which you're seeking to extradite somebody. You can then make a showing that they should be extradited, and you can use that country's adjudicatory process to get them arrested and transferred to the United States. And that's what extradition treaties talk about, and they have a list of crimes that are extraditable between those two countries. The problem here is we do not have an extradition treaty with Russia. And so we can't use that mechanism either. That, in fact, is why Edward Snowden is in Russia, because he's not going to be extradited because we don't have an extradition treaty with Russia. That is why Julian Assange is in the Ecuadorian embassy. Because the Ecuador does not have an extradition treaty with the United States, doesn't have an extradition treaty with Great Britain, doesn't have an extradition treaty with Sweden, the countries involved in the mess relating to Julian Assange, the founder and leader of WikiLeaks. So practically speaking, you can indict somebody as a legal matter, even though they never set foot in the United States and committing the crime. You're just never, unless they do something stupid like going to a country with which the United States has an extradition treaty where they could be arrested, you're not going to be able to extradite them. You're not going to be able to bring them to this country. You're not going to be able to get justice through the United States federal criminal justice system. So that leaves the problem of, so what do we do instead of that? Arguably, the hacking that the state-sponsored hacking that occurred during the 2016 election calls, arguably, by some accounts, certainly James Comey account before the Senate Intelligence Committee, he claimed that it was an attack on the integrity of our electoral system. Accepting the fact that there's no evidence that any votes were changed, we still now, on an ongoing basis, are going to be more skeptical about our electoral process, who is influencing it. And that is the broader concern with these kind of hacking attacks and other kinds of attacks on our electoral process that the 13 residents of St. Petersburg engaged in, apparently sponsored by the Russian government. So the question really becomes, what do we do about unprosecutable cybercrime? Three possible solutions. We engage in diplomacy, in this case with Russia, to see if we can negotiate some satisfactory resolution. I think given the current president and given the current nature of our relationship with Russia, that diplomacy is not going to amount to much, particularly since Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, denies this, that the Russian state sponsored any hacking. So diplomacy is an option, but not a particularly effective one. You can engage in sanctions, which we have tried to do, but what kind of sanctions will work? Generally speaking, the broad countrywide sanctions are not particularly effective. There's a lot of unintended but real collateral and damage if you have broad countrywide sanctions on trade or other things like that, and you're punishing citizens of a country that had nothing to do with what their government has done, less punishment on the government itself. Or you can do individual specific sanctions. No particular positive effect, trying to sanction the individuals that we believe engage in this kind of behavior, which to the extent we even can identify them. So it's, or we can just say, oh, well, we can try and hack into the Russian electoral system, but that's not our electoral system that has any kind of integrity anyway. So it's not really going to make any difference whatsoever. So there's this real conundrum of these are real crimes that are being committed that potentially are having significant effect on the integrity of our electoral process, but we have little that we can do about it. And it raises the question, the broader question of what we do about state-sponsored cyber attacks. I mean, the nature of cyber attacks is that they are antiseptic. They're not bombing runs. They're not flying a plane, entering the physical airspace of a country and dropping bombs on the country and causing financial damage, serious bodily injury, or death. They're not like physical invasions of country where you're sending people across borders physically into another country. There's no physical invasion of the country. No one, particularly in the instance of the DN's Democratic National Committee hackings and the hackings on the electoral boards, nobody entered the country to do that. They were completely done from apparently Russia or the Ukraine. So they're very antiseptic. They can be very powerful. So what is the measure? The fundamental question is, what kind of damage must a cyber attack cause to be cause for declaring war on that country? Some of the examples are easy. If they hacked into a dam, a dam holding back a very large lake, and cause that dam to release a lot of water that would cause significant flooding, resulting in financial damage and serious bodily injury and death. That kind of thing, similar to old-fashioned bombing runs, might well be tangible cause for declaring war on that country. Of course, it raises the question of what do we do when we declare war after that kind of antiseptic cyber attack? Do we only attack that country in a cyber fashion, or do we invade a country? Is there any kind of cyber attack that is cause for invading a country or for doing a bombing run over that country? But short of that kind of disastrous effect of a cyber attack, what about a less disastrous effect? Shutting down the utility grid in the Northeast for a week. Let's assume for purposes of this hypothetical that nobody is killed from that. Businesses lose money, a tremendous, at the least, inconvenience, a large cost to any number of state, local, and federal governmental institutions and private businesses. Is that cause for declaring war on another country? The final point here is we do not have rules in place for what counts as a cyber attack worthy of a military response of some sort. The Department of Defense's Law of War Manual has started to address, its most recent iteration has started to address this question, but it really hasn't done a good job. I mean, it's a good start, but it really thinks about it by analogy to past kinds of attacks, military attacks, bombing runs, physical invasion by troops. There's no, and analogies to the past don't account for the kind of damage that cyber attacks can do that is very significant, but doesn't cost a lot of money, and it doesn't kill anybody, but causes, for example, a ongoing lack of trust, or it attacks the integrity of an important system in the United States. like the electoral system in the case of the 2016 election. So we're still sorting that out. Earlier this century, apparently there was a state-sponsored cyber attack on banks and governmental institutions in Estonia that caused significant disruption in terms of the government and the banking system. The government of Estonia, which is a part of NATO, appealed to NATO using Article 5 of NATO and said, Article 5 of NATO says, an attack on one of our members constitutes an attack on all of our members, and we all come to the country's defense. NATO, when appealed to by Estonia saying, we want to invoke Article 5, NATO said, nope, doesn't count as the kind of attack we envisioned under Article 5. Since then, NATO has convened a group of experts, and they've come out with two manuals, the Tallinn Manual 1.0 and the Tallinn Manual 2.0, that takes another pass at coming up with a set of rules given current international law and the current understandings and customs about the law of war internationally, both at the UN and elsewhere, to measure cyber attacks and their significance. Unfortunately, they too struggle with the hardest piece. That is, how do we measure an antiseptic cyber attack of the kind we just talked about, or of the kind on Estonia? If a bombing attack just caused financial damage and caused no death and disrupted a government, would you ever go to war over that? Would a country ever go to war over that? There are no good measurements yet of how to think about cyber attacks as a possible cause for war, be it a military invasion or a bombing run of some sort. And that's the conundrum that we face in circumstances where a cyber attack constitutes a crime, but even though one can charge somebody with the crime, you end up not being able to prosecute them because you can't get them to this country. You can't sometimes even identify who it is. And that is where we are. It's a fascinating problem, and it's a problem that unless we want governments, be it presidents or legislatures, to respond in an emotional way to a particular kind of cyber attack and make that a cause for war, we need to develop a set of standards to govern and mediate this circumstance. With that, I welcome your questions.
So you do have one question. What happens if the hacks originate from disputed territories such as South Ossetia, Crimea, or parts of Carpathia? Do extradition treaties even cover disputed territory?
No, they don't. I mean, to the extent that the disputed territory is claimed by a country with which the United States has an extradition treaty, it may, but that still calls into question to what extent the judicial system in that disputed territory remains functioning and can be used as part of the extradition process. So I think the question hits a very good point that it gets even more confusing when we're talking about disputed areas like those you described, disputed areas in Ukraine, for example, where it's very, very likely that cyber attacks are originating out of there. So it makes it even more difficult, and it makes it very much more likely that hackers who want protection will locate themselves in those kind of areas. It gets them more protection. The only risk for them is they won't have a functioning internet system in that country.